Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Nevin, your host, the Politically Homeless podcast, and with me is geopolitical analyst and author Jeff Nyquist, one of our many great guests that we have. And today we're going to talk about the movies. We're going to be talking about the movie Civil War that was recently in the theaters, and there's no better person than Jeff Nyquist to talk about this movie, because I have a lot of thoughts about it. But Jeff, what do you think of the movie? I know it's an open-ended question, but what are your thoughts?
I saw the director talking about it. It's not a very pleasant movie. If you like America, if you've grown up here, someone of my generation especially. He sort of, it's very subtle, but of course the president of the U.S. is some kind of conservative who's being overthrown by the Western states that are marching against him, and you see bodies hanging from overpasses. You see terrible executions and tortures of Americans by Americans. You see just hair trigger psychopaths gunning down civilians, and it's the movie's about, not to do a spoiler, it's about journalists, war photographers and journalists covering an American Civil War. And of course, I think the problem I have with it is that the downplaying of the ideological content. The reason for the Civil War you can kind of piece together in a movie. It's because the president of the United States got rid of the FBI and did some and extended his term of office unconstitutionally. Like people say, Trump won't leave office, right? And so it's sort of, that's why it's a sort of a Trump-like figure, and of course they're going after him. But it's really, like all good action movies, it's mainly about the action, right? So you're sort of getting the political indoctrination is very much subliminal, I would say. And the director definitely is a man of the left. And of course, he doesn't like the idea of a civil war in America. And of course, I think in his mind, he blames the people on the right, but he doesn't want to see a civil war. To his credit, he doesn't want to see it. But of course, to see each side, to see the other in a reasonable way is kind of, it's getting more difficult for people.
Yeah, it was a great movie as far as the action and the storyline. Because I'm also a geopolitical geek, I like more of a backstory and world building. What was going on in the rest of the world? What really led to this conflict? When you look at a map, it's on the Wikipedia page for the Civil War movie, as well as the movie's website. There were actually four different factions. There was the Western forces, which consisted of Texas and California, which is kind of an unlikely alliance given that opposites of political cultures in those states. And then you have the Florida alliance, which is really not made clear what their ideology is. You have the federal government, which the only things they talk about, they don't really talk about an ideology. With the federal government, they talk about the abolition of the FBI, and there are both people on the left as well as the MAGA right that call for the abolition of the FBI, which of course you and I are on record as being against. We have to have a strong internal security in this country. The president, he is dressed conservatively, but we would expect that of any of our leaders to be dressed in business suits and whatnot. We just don't know. Then we have, which is not covered, and I don't want to sound sour grapes, but I think this is very significant. There was a faction that was not mentioned in the movie, but it was mentioned on the movie's website, and I suspect the script. I would like to get a copy of the script. which is something called the New People's Army, which is in parts of the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies. And that was been described as explicitly Maoist communist. And we know as a Maoist communist organization, they would be extremely brutal, as brutal as the other groups would be, if not more brutal, because they would have a scientific totalitarian approach to governance. So the other part that I felt was rather strange, not strange, but an important part is I don't believe that Russia and China would sit on their hands and just twiddle their thumbs while the United States burns. I would argue that the Russians and Chinese would take advantage of the discord. I mean, look, I would argue that they would be behind the discord in all of those factions through agent provocateur actions in order to stoke a civil war, which you have documented and many others have documented on programs and writings. So I think Russia and China would intervene with troops, and they would use the excuse, if I were to do a world building, is to prevent militarist forces from capturing our nuclear weapons and setting them off on the rest of the world. And to restore peace to the United States, they would intervene and restore order. They probably would use under the pretext of a captured or dominated UN to do that. And then they would have their list of collaborators and traitors. And look, I don't want to sound like an extreme right-wing nut job to the audience out there, but there are plenty of traitors and collaborators that would join the invaders for a myriad of reasons. So those are the holes in the story. I mean, the acting was very good. The action was really good. Where you talk about the political bias, it's interesting you mentioned that. They do, after watching it again, I watched it twice, it was never made clear who they were. The gentleman who was wearing those red-colored circular sunglasses that was executing people, and when he said, well, what kind of American are you? Oh, you're from Michigan, or Missouri, you're from Florida, you're from Colorado. Well, what are you afraid of? Tell me where you're from, to an Asian-looking fellow. And he said, Hong Kong, and boom, Chinese. So that is highlighting somebody who either could be.
That was actually a Japanese journalist he killed.
Oh, I thought you said Hong Kong, and then he said China.
He was a Japanese journalist. They were both Japanese. They were two Japanese journalists they ran into, I don't know if the guy happened to live in Hong Kong, but they were Japanese.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good that you caught that.
But it's
but it shows one side that's like, okay, you're going to get xenophobic nationalists. So they did highlight that, not so subtly. So one could argue reasonably that there was a political bias, but then they didn't show the New People's Army. And again, I'm not trying to sound like sour grapes, because I know, from what I understand, I mean, this is me reading about the movie 2 months ago, the intentions were not to be overtly political. But if you didn't want to be political, you got to show all sides of the political spectrum engaging in horrific acts. So did you want to add anything to what I stated? Is there anything you agree or disagree? What are your thoughts? I know I gave a lot of opinions here, but.
Well, the purpose of drama, the purpose of fiction, the purpose of drama originally in ancient Greece, the purpose of the tragedy is, said Aristotle, to cause people to purge negative emotions, right? In his Poetics, Aristotle said this, so that you weep and you get rid of the negative emotion. It doesn't quite have that purging effect. It is rather almost disorienting, because the most important question, if there's a civil war in America, is why? What are the two sides? What are the actual ideals that they're fighting for? In the Civil War, the secession of the slave states was because they thought slavery was endangered by Lincoln's election. That's a very clear motivation. And so what is the motivation here? There's nothing, because it's such an incredible thesis, and yet people have it on their lips. He is almost in a way giving weight to the idea without actually giving any real form to it, any cogent form to it. And this is a very nasty, this is the journalistic technique of everything's very blurry, nothing is in focus. We have no context for anything, for understanding anything. And it's just a little, it's like a salad with different things. It's like, well, how did cactus get in my salad? You know, I mean, what are Maoists doing here? And how come there's not Chinese troops landing, like you pointed out? Where's Canada and Mexico in this? Where are the Cubans in this? Are the Cubans coming into Florida? What about the Russians? What about the nukes? We're nuclear power. And there's nothing touching on any of these questions, which are strategic questions and political, philosophic questions. So nothing deep, you know. This is the problem, is that if you want to do good fiction about something like this, don't you want to be deep? I mean, this is why it rates as just an action picture with some maybe some subtle subliminal left-wing jabs in there for those that could pick up on them, you know, that could realize that the president is a kind of Trump, very subtly done Trump, a younger version of Trump, right?
Well, what tipped you off at these subtleties? I'd like you to expand upon that.
Well, the fact that they're advancing once they get behind the government lines, they start running into these. They start running into the right wingers and the really bad people, you know. And but it was the advance on the White House and thinking about the why it is that the president. Remember, it was the FBI that was investigating Trump as a Russian puppet, right? It was the FBI going after Trump. Trump was at odds with the intelligence community, and it was the claim that Trump wouldn't leave office. You know, that he that he would not leave office in 2020, in 2021, I should say, rather, which is what January 6th is about, right? So there's these. It's rather obvious. It's about a right-wing president who won't leave office, and he gets rid of the FBI. Of course, we know who controls the FBI, the Justice Department now. They're controlled by the left in this country. So it's pretty easy to read that. I mean, he's not, that part of it isn't too subtle. But they don't mention it much in the movie. And of course, it's about how terrible war is. But you see, the thing is that there are worse things than dying in a war. Dying in a war is pretty horrible. Everybody's going to die. Life is a limited thing. It's terrible when a young person dies. But the thing is that what's more terrible? If a society is subjected to a communist dictatorship,
Well, in the
what
movie,
is that? How many more millions, more people die from communist dictatorships than the wars surrounding those dictatorships? More people die in peacetime in the 20th century from communist dictatorships than from all the wars of the 20th century.
well, you know, I would actually disagree with your view that it's actually peace. And I'm not trying to play semantic games. Obviously, it's not my intention. But communist dictatorships are a war against their own people. There's always a constant military footing, and they're constantly on not only a war footing, but they were also constantly subverting. And you know this, obviously.
I'm defining war like Clausewitz defines it, like the dictionary defines it, as military action between two powers.
Right.
You know, if you're killing your own people, that's more of a police matter. And the killing is done in the Soviet Union and China, not by army troops. The killing's done by the NKVD, the KGB, the Interior Ministry troops, the Gulag troops. These are not military forces.
Exactly, and I agree with you. I mean, in substance, I agree with you,
Yeah.
and I think that's an excellent point. Now, moving forward, regarding the movie, do you think civil war is a possibility in the United States? And if so, what would it look like? Have you kind of gamed this in your head and looked at the possibilities? We know that the Russians have predicted it. I mean, they've stated openly, they're academics like Igor Panarin.
Yeah.
In recent stories in Soviet or Russian media like Novosti, they have cited even Harvard University studies which predict the possibility of civil war. We know that even if you follow certain Twitter accounts, Ukrainians that reproduce Russian media, Russian TV media stars. I forget one gentleman. He's a particularly loathsome individual, Solyov. Terrible,
Soloviev. Yeah.
terrible, terrible. And he talks about civil war and wishing civil war in the United States.
Oh, and so has other Russian politicians wished civil war on us. It's their wishful thinking. I mean, Igor Panarin was assigned to this idea of studying the notion of a civil war in America back when the Soviet Union still existed in '91. Um, there was a book that when I wrote for Sierra Times 20 something years ago called Civil War II. I've got it in my library somewhere. I don't remember the author. The author was kind of got mad at me because of the review I wrote of it. Um, the review I wrote is that the United States needs to be unified. And I didn't find the authors seemingly liked, it seemed to me that he liked the idea of a civil war, that somehow the Confederacy, along with other elements, the old Confederacy, you were going to have a uniting of certain groups against the federal government. You were going to actually have a civil war in which the United States, you actually had some kind of new country emerging out of the United States. And I criticized it because the United States, I go back to Hamilton and George Washington. George Washington and Hamilton said the same things, referred to similar things in the Federalist Papers. But in Washington's farewell address, who some people think Hamilton had a hand in helping Washington craft, there's a passage which it says that one of the great blessings of Americans is that you are one country. And that if anybody tries to divide you east from west, north from south, they are an enemy. Um, and I think that idea in Washington's farewell address is extremely important. If anybody talks about dividing the United States, they're an enemy of all Americans, because our strength and our success and our prosperity has come from the fact that North America didn't become Europe. We got Mexico, the US, and Canada here. And the United States is so overwhelmingly powerful, there's been peace here. Nobody's going to attack us here in our own hemisphere. We're secure. And we're secure to engage in commerce and to have prosperity and to be able to assure that the balance of power on the world island, as Dugan likes to call it, remains as such that nobody can get total control of it and therefore, isolate us and destroy us. I mean, that's sensible. Sensible, and you have the Monroe Doctrine and whatnot. If you divide America, you now have something where countries like Russia and China can come on either side of this division. And they can get into the hemisphere, as they're already doing now, as we're lackadaisical about Chinese and Russian penetration of Latin America. So it's a really horrific thing, because we would not survive being divided. We just wouldn't. Because right now our nuclear deterrent, we've lost a lot of strength vis-a-vis Russia and China. Russia and China have a lot of problems. They could obviously collapse and fail to push an offensive. Russia's not been doing well in Ukraine. It's the third year of the Ukraine war. But if the United States were to split into a civil war, Russia and China would be empowered manyfold. Many of our allies would abandon us, would be forced into some kind of accommodation with Beijing and or Moscow. Our alliance system would fall apart, and then we would be isolated and divided, which would be fatal. And Americans would live on their knees, most likely, if they lived at all. People don't understand. We've entered an era of mass destruction weapons, biological, chemical, and nuclear, but also of ideologies that call for mass destruction, like communism, like National Socialism, and like the emerging, I guess you could call it the new racism and anti-Semitism that's emerging, which I
Yeah,
think the Russians and Chinese are exploiting. Yeah.
yeah. I want you to expand upon that more about what the defectors have stated about supporting groups uh, that are itching for a civil war in the United States. I know I hate to put you on the spot, but I know you, I mean, for those of you who are just joining us and new to the program, Jeff has debriefed a number of defectors from Russia, from China, from Latin America, Iran, and elsewhere. Jeff has also studied much of the primary source literature of the Soviet command. Jeff is unfortunately and unfortunately, actually knew actual communists when he was in undergraduate school, and was basically
When I was
denied
in graduate school.
when in graduate school. Excuse me,
Yeah.
sorry, um, and was denied and blacklisted from having an academic career as a result of not accepting the precepts of Marxism-Leninism. So he has seen these folks in action and became really never particularly cared for those doctrines and became even more turned off by them. And that's, of course, the biggest item that Jeff and I have in common. And what do these defectors say about supporting groups in the United States, the communists that you've come across, about civil war as far back as the 1980s? Can you elaborate on that and give us a whole historical document dump if you can? I know that's a tall order,
Well,
but
I don't remember discussing Civil War in America with them. I have to go back in my memory. I mean, Igor Panarin is the one that talks about this. Colonel Lunev would say, you have to keep your Constitution no matter what, because the Constitution is your strength. He used to say that. And Lunev was a very intelligent, very knowledgeable. He had worked in China for the Soviet Union in the 1980s. He was the deputy head of the GRU in the United States before his defection. GRU is the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, before that, the Soviet General Staff. And of course, the Constitution, if there's a civil war, it is a war against the Constitution, because you're talking about some portion of the country throwing the Constitution in the toilet. So the Constitution is a document that that holds the country together, constitutes the federal government, says what the difference in the rights and powers of the states and the federal government are, and how the federal government's divided into three branches and so on. You get rid of that Constitution, the compact of the states is gone. And the states are governments. They are considered at one time sovereign. Perhaps they are sovereign in a sense. They're sovereign in the sense that under the Constitution, they're self-governing entities that have ostensibly, they're supposed to have their own militias. We have the National Guard now, and we sort of, that part of the Constitution, we kind of, I don't know, we kind of fudged it. We're not really following the militia part of the Constitution, because technically, all the able-bodied men of a state are supposed to constitute the militia of that state. And they're supposed to be, meeting and training. And they're supposed to do, if there's a hurricane or there's a need of, a flood or something, where they come in and do the repairs and the operations, and they fix the levees, and they, make sure the people get food, rather than these federal agencies. So we've departed from the Constitution in some areas, and maybe in some areas for practical reasons, but then perhaps it's not good, right? Because the Constitution, you start to depart from it, and at what point are you no longer actually respecting it? And that is a problem. But so that was Lunev's comments on it. Um, I think in large sense you have Panarin's map of the United States. Have you seen it?
Yes, yes, I have when it was first reported. Oh,
And in
back in,
his map, he actually shows how these different, what he has it broken into 5 different countries, the United States. But
yes,
you'll
and
notice that each of these countries is under a communist power. They're under China, or they're under Mexico, or they're under, right? They're under these different powers. And so I think that this almost reminds me of some of the Weather Underground folks talking about how Americans would be, they would be have to kill what, 30 million Americans and re-educate the rest. But then you go to Chiao Chen's secret speech. And this is reinforced by what Lunev told me, is that China is not interested in the United States existing as a country. So any talk of a civil war, you have China and Russia at the end of the Cold War got together and decided they were going to have an intelligence alliance and also a military alliance to prepare for the next war. And in that next war, they anticipated taking North America, and Russia would get parts of Alaska and parts of Canada, sorry, and China would get the lower 48 states. Well, the secret speech of Chiao Chen talks about creating a second China in the lower 48 states, which is, and there's things in there that dovetail with things that Lunev told me about, which made me first sit up and take notice of the secret speech. Because when you look at it, you go, well, this has to be a fabrication. But who would fabricate it, right? That's a good question. And then it turns out I met the colonel, or had a long conversation with one of the colonels in the Pentagon that translated Chiao Chen's speech into English, and said, well, how did you validate it? Well, they did voice recognition, not voice rec, sorry, they did the recognition of his Mandarin. That is that the use of language, you can actually determine who is speaking, who wrote a speech by looking at their previous speeches, and then you find there's a certain repetition of words, a certain way of expression, certain expressions that repeat themselves. And this has become a science. They've got computer programs now that can determine if a person is the author or it spoke something. And of course, a lot of these Chinese leaders, Chiao Chen is the defense minister. He was a very smart guy. He was a very brainy guy. When you look at him, a very smart man, as some of the Chinese leaders are. And of course, what he says in there is that they're going to exterminate the population of the United States and replace them with Chinese, make a second China. They even talks in the speech about, well, Chinese that are nationalized, um, uh, naturalized Americans or become Americans might have to be exterminated because they've become Americans. And so the real problem that you have here is that, okay, if you understand, Lunev said that the Chinese want the lower 48. Chiao Chen said the reason they want it is to build a second China, which means it's not America anymore. So you're actually talking about a civil war leading to the potential genocide of the country. This is my take on it. People are going, oh, Nyquist, you're crazy. We're going to have a civil war, and they dream of some kind of Confederate utopia or whatever, that we're going to create a separate country from all of these lefties. We're going to have a country without abortion. We're going to have a country without all these liberal or leftist ideas in them. No, you're not. Those ideas exist in every single one of these um, states that would break away. If you have the red states breaking away from the blue states, those red states already have the incubus of leftism in them. And why would they not succumb? Look at who's controlling their schools. The communists go everywhere. They go in every state. I think the most right-wing state is Idaho, right? I think they voted 75% for Trump or something. That could be wrong. In 2016, I'm not remembering, but maybe someone will correct me. But I think it's the most conservative state. Well, the other states are not as red as all that, and they don't have big cities in them. That's not where New York and LA and the big commerce. And the problem is like the Confederacy, how are they going to survive? And the phenomenon of leftism, of the new religion of socialism, spreads the same way Christianity spread in the ancient Roman Empire. It's a phenomenon of the urban centers, right? So the new religions, when a new religion comes to take away, to overcome the old religion, the word pagan means ignorant country dweller. The word redneck means ignorant country dweller, right? Flyover country. What do they say about us? We're yokels out here in the Midwest, in flyover country, in the South, in the Bible Belt. We're yokels. The problem is that you're not doing anything about the problem that everything is moving further to the left all the time. Now, Nevin, you are very well read. You've been watching events. Am I wrong? Is everything not moving further to the left all the time?
Well, sure, in certain areas, certainly. I mean, in academia.
I mean everywhere.
In academia, for example, is one of the reasons why I didn't pursue a professorship, because on certain subjects, I would not be accepted by the standard leftist, Marxist, new left penetration of academia, which, Bertol Ullman, I mean, I don't mean to digress a little, but Bertol Ullman, who was a top Marxist professor, said there were thousands, I forget the statistics, it's in my latest book, 2-volume book, and it's mentioned by other people, of course, thousands of Marxists on American campuses. And of course, what I take issue with Marx is specifically his programmatic goals of despotic inroads on private property. Many of you know I'm libertarian economically, but when you call for basically totalitarianism, which is the heart of Marxist program, as he calls for in the manifesto at the end. I read it in undergraduate school, Professor Livingston class. I'm glad he assigned it to us. That's what's being played with, and you have thousands and thousands of them carrying this bacillus, which erodes our country in so many ways. Now, to bring up the other point, to supplement what your valuable information that you had talked about regarding Colonel Lunev, General Chiao Shin, and Igor Panarin, the Soviets and their allies, for a long, long period of time, there is a documented record of them wanting to divide the United States and foment civil war. It's not crazy. This is not crazy Gussack bouncing off of what crazy Nyquist is saying, right-wing paranoia. It's a fact, unfortunately. Take a look at
Mr. Wang of Luda Media, just in one of his more recent interviews with me, mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party has the same idea, to divide Americans. And what he said is something I've observed, is that the Chinese control the United Front, which is all the old communist front organizations, and the Russians, who are teamed up with the Chinese, are infiltrating the right and trying to control and turn the right into a puppet movement. This is where you get your scissors strategy, coming from the right and the left, the Russians controlling the right, the Chinese controlling the left. And of course, this is Golitsyn talks about the scissors strategy, and this is just standard dialectics.
Yeah, when you take a look at, for example, General, I think his name was Zygmunt Moldelsky, who was a military attaché at the Polish embassy in Washington, D.C. And he gave congressional testimony back in 1949, which you talked about not only fomenting strikes by communist-penetrated labor unions, which, by the way, I'm a strong supporter of labor unions when needed, but I think it's a terrible misuse, to make it very clear to my left-wing listeners, for communists to use labor unions and exploit them. It's a terrible misuse of that institution. But anyways, he talked about fomenting that the Russians and their allies had a plan to foment not only industrial strikes in the United States, but also to split the United States according to different racial groups. The Communist Party USA, since at least the 1920s, talked about creating a separate Negro Soviet Republic. in the Black Belt and parts of the South. When we talk about the Nazis, according to Jan Valtin, who wrote a book, a tell-all book. He had worked as an informer, an agent for the Gestapo. He talked about the Nazi plan to tear this country up through civil war and divisions according to class and race in the United States, presumably. When you look at, for example, the Weather Underground, as you had mentioned before, where the plan was, obviously, we know they were consulting with communist allies globally about how the North Vietnamese, the Cubans, the Soviets, and the Chinese, the PRC and North Koreans would all want to occupy parts of the United States upon a takeover by the United States of the Weather Underground. And Eldridge Cleaver, who defected from the Black Panther Party, he had talked about, and this is even revealed in internal documents of the North Koreans, as published by the Cold War International History Project. The Black Panthers and other allied revolutionary groups talked about a revolution from the belly of the beast. They would have revolutionary forces gain power, and then internally revolutionary forces take over in the United States too as well. We talk about Louis Farrakhan in cooperation with Libya, where there was blatant admissions. This is Gaddafi's Libya, all talking about how the United States would be split into red Indian nations, black Indian nations. You remember that from the 1980s, Jeff. We talk about Władysław Rurars, who was a Polish diplomat who defected from Poland in the early 1980s, and he recalled a Soviet official, unnamed, this was an Accuracy Media report, talking about the Soviet official saying that they had a plan very similar to the Zimmerman telegraph of World War I to bribe Mexico with a handover of much of the American Southwest states to a Mexico in the event Mexico joined a war, a third world war with the Soviet Union. Guess what they named that Southwest back in the 80s? Azotlan. Amazing, Jeff. Mm-hmm. There were defectors like Jan Buchar, and then a Soviet, who was a Czechoslovakian army defector who testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and then another Soviet army defector. I don't remember his name. His last name begins with a Z. And they talked about how the Soviets would reabsorb Alaska back into the United States.
In fact, the Russians now have big billboards up in Siberia saying Alaska is ours.
Yes.
And they've had some major figures say that, well, we didn't really sell Alaska to America. We just loaned it. Now they have to give it back. Same thing as the invasion of Ukraine. They claim some area. They start making claims that some area belongs to them, and then they justify moving into it with troops. They would not, by the way, the Russians would never. They have. I think it was 2001. They passed legislation. This was crazy. The crazy head of the Liberal Democratic Party in Russia. They passed legislation to actually set up a Russian government for Alaska as a province of Russia. So, and that was more than 20 years ago. They do these things because there is some idea in their head in the future that they are going to actually own it. And it sounds crazy. You know, when I was a kid in the 1960s, it just seemed America was just so powerful, so strong. It was inconceivable to just about anybody that anyone could challenge the United States. And of course, we had tremendous nuclear power, tremendous weapons. And yet, look at where we are now. After 33 years after we think the Soviet Union went down, we suddenly find ourselves without with a nuclear arsenal, which by the testimony of the head of the Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, in 2020, that it would be obsolete it would be past its shelf life in 3 years. Well, it's 2024. It's 4 years since that time. He gave them more than 4 years. So we're looking at a strategic arsenal, nuclear arsenal that's past its shelf life. We're looking at Minuteman III missiles that it's been said by numerous people they just won't last much longer. That they're going bad. I mean, half of our launches over the last several years, and now we had a successful launch, so it's a little bit less than half. I mean, that have failed, right? And so this isn't good when you only have 450 strategic missiles and none of them have multiple warheads on them. If half of them can't make it to their target, you don't have enough missiles to take out all the strategic bases in China, let alone Russia.
Yeah.
You don't have, you can't win a nuclear war, which people
You don't.
think, oh, that's impossible. No, I'm sorry, you've been propagandized by the idea that nuclear weapons end the world. It doesn't.
Look, nuclear.
Unfortunately, the world will continue, and you'll be the loser in that world.
Yeah, nuclear war. Well, well, I mean the, I mean the Soviets and now the Russians and the Chinese. They do believe, and they say in their own writings and their own doctrine, quite openly, which you and I have on our personal libraries. They say they can win nuclear war.
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
I know it sounds crazy, and the losses would be catastrophic. But there's, I don't mean to digress, but of course I got to mention the testimony in the book Comrade J by Sergei Tretyakov.
Tretyakov, yeah.
And he has
Tretyakov.
talked about in detail, and I think it's been mentioned in other sources, maybe you can elaborate on that, but Tretyakov talked about and revealed information of which he was personally involved with, where the idea of nuclear winter was actually concocted by the Soviets. And the problem is, and I know we're going into the topic of Soviet disinformation, but it's crafted. And I always say this, when it comes to Soviet, now Russian, now Chinese, through their agents and allies the globe over, they always are trying to manipulate well-meaning individuals, either through literally concocting problems or concocting atrocities or problems, or taking advantage of legitimate concerns of people. And they never ever say what their end goal is. Why? Because if they said, we want to just destroy private property, set up re-education camps, exterminate millions of people, scientifically control your thoughts, your diet, everything, people are going to be like, pardon my language, F this. I don't want to be associated with you. So that's why they have to conceal themselves. And this is getting back to the Civil War issue. They're concealing themselves, in my opinion, through elements of the so-called right, so-called left. And what they're trying to do is provoke two sides, because our country, as you have pointed out, we have become very disunited. There are extreme fissures in our society, in politics and class and race and everything else. That's not a good thing. We need to be unified. And we could debate how we become more unified nation at a different time. But we as Americans, we do have to come together. Now, regarding our nuclear weapons and whatnot, it's even worse than even that. You know, we do not have enough of an anti-missile system, of which I'm a fierce advocate for, because our people is our most precious natural resource. And then we don't have a meaningful civil defense either. And if people want to read an albeit very expensive plan, but very doable plan, take a look at the Gaither report, which Jeff on his website, I think at the older version of his website, correct me if I'm wrong, had published at length in PDF format. And it's a very interesting document to read. And we just don't have any of these meaningful programs in place. And yes, we have to be prepared, God forbid, to fight a nuclear war. We need to have our missiles that have the enriched uranium inside. It's not a pleasant thing. I don't like it. Guns and missiles are not pleasant, but we need to have them because we're not living in a world where everybody are angels and Mother Teresa's. And that's unfortunately the way the world is. I didn't create it that way. You didn't create it this way. It's just it is. And before you continue and offer comments, the first obligation of government, and it is in the preamble in the Constitution in two parts: common defense and domestic tranquility, which translates to national defense and national security. And that's it's like a father and mother protecting the kids. The first job is to protect their kids against predators, getting injured unnecessarily, and things of that nature. Anything to add to that? Any more, especially about the Civil War and the Russian, Soviet, Chinese role? Anything else, and any other additional
Well,
comments?
you know that the communists had this idea of rallying black people as a group to fight a civil war, of exploiting other ethnic groups, American Indians, the poor, certain ethnic minorities, immigrants. And you look at the program of the Communist Party USA, it's basically everybody but white males, basically, to form a supermajority to push past the Constitution and create a socialist republic here. If they can, if they can cause Americans to be so angry with each other, because if you, through the media, moving the country further to the left, and there's the book Left Turn by Grosclose, and it shows how we've been steadily moving to the left. If you have any group that resists this, now what you have is you don't have anti-communist conservatives anymore, because the conservatives are degenerating and becoming alt-right, which is uncomfortably close to embracing reactionary views, anti-Semitism, the old Confederacy, National Socialist type things. Maybe not exactly. You know what I'm talking about.
They're very close in some
Yeah.
of their positions, and like
Right.
Nicholas Fuentes of America, so-called America First, who has actually hope openly for a Chinese and Russian takeover, and he's
Yeah.
demanding more people.
And Fuentes is very intelligent and very crazy, and he's very passionate. And the thing is that there's a lot of younger people, to my great chagrin, who find this kind of discourse alluring, which is, and let me tell you, for those people that if you happen to be listening, um, this is extremely dangerous. And this guy is wrong. He's not just wrong, but he's going to hurt a lot of people. And he's disorienting people, Fuentes. And if you listen to that guy too much, you'll be disoriented. You won't know who your real enemies and friends are, and you won't realize that this guy's an enemy, Fuentes.
Yeah, how
Because you
can you be
can't,
American
there is
First?
no commonwealth that's going to exist based on his ideas unless it's a very pathological one, an
Well,
evil one.
when you look at what he says, and he gyrates back and forth on certain points on economics and politics, he calls for a Russia-China hegemony throughout the world and even victory over the United States in so many words. I
Yeah,
don't have the exact quote in front of me.
yeah.
He exudes the worst forms, in my opinion, of economic and political statism and populism. And I have populist tendencies, but
And
more of
doesn't
a
he claim to be an ultra strict Catholic,
yes, yes, he does.
which
Uh,
is really very dismaying, you know?
but he is also accused of also being a homosexual, and not that I have anything against homosexuals per se. On a group level, there is that hypocrisy with
Someone
them.
accused him of that?
Yes, yes. You just look it up online and Google it. You'll find it. I've heard it on YouTube and whatnot. You know what you
Is
find?
that just, is that, are
I
they
don't know. I
just,
don't know the guy, and frankly,
yeah.
I would not cooperate or
You
reach
know,
out.
it's very, all of it is very, I mean, I'm very disturbed when I listen to him talk, and I get a very bad feeling from him.
So do I. I get a
Yeah,
bad vibe about him personally.
yeah. And see, it's the same thing with he's a Catholic professor that got kicked out of his position. He wrote a pretty good book on music, on the degeneration of music. But then he wrote this book called um, It was about Judaism and about how Jews were the people of rebellion. I can't remember the name of the book. I read parts of it, and it actually was very disturbing. It's a very disturbed point of view, because what you have is you have these attempts through scholarship to revive anti-Semitism,
Yes.
right? And this is an old-fashioned sort of medieval church anti-Semitism, kind of anti-Semitism that doesn't exist in the, or it isn't that prevalent in the Catholic Church today. And it's just
Well,
it's
you
very
know, and that's
disturbing.
the product that has created the Ustashas and the Hlinka People's Party of the old wartime Slovakia, which was fascism. I mean, E. Michael Jones, for
Michael
example,
Jones, that's who I'm talking
is
about.
another one. Then there's another academic anti-Jewish fellow who's a bit of a populist fascist type. The one who's the culture of critique and countercurrents and
Oh yeah, culture
that.
of critique. Yeah, see, the thing is that look, I had social science training. I read the culture of critique, and I'm thinking, he's making all these methodological and errors of the context he creates for his information, because he's already starting with an assumption about Jewish people before he's even begun, because he can't possibly substantiate what he's claiming, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, Nevin, do you believe that Jews control our culture?
Well, don't they? Don't you believe that? I mean, we control the banking, we control the cinema. No, obviously not. The Jewish people, just like every ethnic, religious class, social class, whatnot. Yes, they'll have degrees of solidarity, but they have tons of divisions and divergences of
Yeah,
opinion.
of course.
That's
It's
just the
not a
way it is.
united, and the thing is that Jews are overrepresented in certain professions. Well, so are Irish people. So are people of certain backgrounds. So are Swedes. Oh, overrepresented in Hollywood. A lot of the technical people have Scandinavian background in Hollywood. And so there's a certain number of people among the producers where you have people with Jewish names, right? So it's like, wait a minute, there are these ethnic differences in professional background, and it has to do with the history of the different ethnic groups that make up the country. But there's the idea that the Jews, 2% of the population, are controlling our culture is absurd.
Yeah, well, the problem with that is not even only absurd, but my thing is that the people that amplify those views, even if they contain truths, even if people are understandably alienated and whatnot from prevailing economic and social systems. The problem is the system that they would impose has been tried and is still being tried in other countries and has resulted in untold millions in death tolls, massive human rights violations. You have to be careful what you ask for, and I'm finally starting and gelling together my essays for a future, hopefully Substack subscription-based service. You know, what I find in these groups from my academic study, I have talked to some of these people. They have reached out to me because I used to call my program the Populist Patriot. And there are good populists and there are very bad populists. It's one of the reasons why I renamed my program the Politically Homeless Podcast. Um, but I ask people, why do you believe in what you believe in? And I've spoken to neo-fascist, National Socialist types, and I tell them I'm Jewish. I don't care. It's just that's who I am, and whatever. And I can have a perfectly civil and academic and pleasant conversation. And same thing with communists. And I ask, why do you believe in what you believe? And what I find is with a lot of activists, they tend to be alienated or well-meaning people that think they're going to have a utopian or better off society. The leaders, however, I've never met. I'm a little scared of interacting with their leaders because I get a vibe from various leaders watching them on TV, like the late Lyndon LaRouche and others, that these are very bad people, that these are very smart people, they're very clever people, they're but they're very dangerous people, that they combine ideological quest for restructuring society with a sociopathic quest for power. And they are not, they have no problem cracking heads and then whistling in the wind and having a beer afterwards. That's my impression.
Well, there's a
they're very dangerous, and
yeah, and see, when you're talking about civil war, you're talking about in the post, after 1900, let's say, and especially in America after 2000. The American Civil War that was fought from 1861 to 65, you had the character of the American people, both in the South and the North. They were a Christian people. They had a very fixed folkways. Society had these stable patterns and beliefs, and there were differences between the North and South, but there was a kind of common decency that Americans had. And for all the violence and the horrible things that happened in the war, there was we were able to get the war behind us because some of this decency shone out in that General Grant let the Confederate soldiers take their horses so they could plow. We didn't take revenge on people. Even the Confederate president wasn't put on the gallows, right? Jefferson Davis, they didn't hang him. Imagine that, you had Reconstruction for, more than a decade, but that ended. And the country healed. There was Jim Crow, so the slaves, the Black Americans got a raw deal for another almost century, but that got straightened out. So but you go to this kind of level of violence and problems now with the kind of ideology of mass destruction, which is what communism is, National Socialism is, anti-Semitism has proved itself to be. These ideologies are ideologies not of reconciliation, but of mass murder, mass killing. They are ideologies of people who lie. And there are no viable ideas. There is just a kind of authoritarianism where the selfishness and the fanaticism of a few people ends up in charge. Basically, criminal regimes emerge out of this. And that's the problem. If our Constitution breaks, if we have a civil war, what do you think the odds, given the kind of culture we have today, since, culture is upstream from politics, what kind of government are they going to produce? What kind of constitution? What kind of leaders? We better cling to what we have. Of course, there might be I don't have any say in it. They might just start a civil war and start killing each other. We might get invaded. But one thing I noticed, it's a lot better if we stay united and we fight some war against an external enemy, because that will unite us as a people. That will congeal us. That will lead us to thought process that, wait a minute, this doesn't work and that doesn't work. And, having women not having children, glorifying them in careers and setting up daycare centers so that the state ends up in control of mommy. In control of baby, and mommy is no more, and that daddy and mommy are separated by the family courts. This kind of pathological society, if we have a major war, will probably naturally come to an end by necessity. People who are suddenly confronted with life and death issues suddenly begin thinking things through and understanding their own existence better, because they're faced with death. And that's my way of looking at it. This is how societies and folkways formed to begin with, was through times of great stress and trouble. And the fall of the Roman Empire and the medieval period, the Dark Ages, everything sort of formed out of that we ended up being Western civilization coming out from the 10th century. And today, as everything is becoming more individuated, differentiated, and more chaotic, as we approach a kind of civil war where everybody is like a bunch of madmen yelling at each other from bell towers or shooting at each other from bell towers, there's going to have to be some kind of, wait a minute, what do we have in common? What can we agree on? It takes hundreds of years for a country to become a country. This was something that Thomas Carlyle wrote. He said it took hundreds of years for England to become a country, for the United Kingdom at that time. Well, it became the United Kingdom while he was a young man, but it for Great Britain to become a country, it took hundreds of years. He said the United States, and he's writing this in the 1850s, United States isn't quite a country yet, right? It isn't fully formed. I fear we've been unforming it, balkanizing it by having millions of people who are not Americans pour into the country. Are they going to become Americans? How is that going to work? How does the melting pot absorb them? If you put too many people in there, the actual American culture, American flavor. Remember, multiculturalism, there's nothing American in it. It's all these other people. We can't make them all Americans? Well, then what do we become? Do we become Yugoslavia, balkanized? Do we become many different countries? We must resist that because the catastrophe of that. We must resist it. So I intellectually resist it and I emotionally resist it because I'm an American and I want my country to be whole. And I want the Constitution to survive. Failing in that, God help us, because I don't see a good path for anybody. I don't think any of the countries that would emerge in North America would have much of a chance of survival. And certainly if they survive, they wouldn't be pretty to live under.
Yeah, and unfortunately, your closing statement there, or closing sentence, unfortunately, I agree with you. I do appreciate the hopeful statement that you made, though, that in the face of an external enemy that we would be unified. And I think the audience would appreciate that. I hope we have the same national spiritual armor that we did when the United States was also badly divided in the 1930s during the precursors to World War II. And we were very divided, this country. And of course, we became unified after December 7th, 1941. Now, the question is of course, in certain many ways, we're living in a different world. In some ways, there's similarities. Is our nation collectively up to the challenge? I don't know. I do appreciate the hopeful comment. I hope we never reach that point of a global third world war, but it is a distinct possibility. Will we be up to the challenge? Only God only knows. And that's something that, we can only be personally and our families and our communities prepared for, as well as, I know this might sound, to some people, not their cup of tea, but I think it's important to also pray as well as be prepared personally, your families, your communities, your networks, and also follow the news. And also, please subscribe, because you could get updates, because it pops up the window on your website, on your blog, J.R. Nyquist blog. Also, be sure to purchase Jeff Nyquist's books. One of my favorites is The Origins of the Fourth World War. It opened my eyes to not only some important facts that Jeff has documented in it, but also some important points of view too as well, that have kind of changed my views in certain ways, and perhaps some unexpected ways by the author. But nevertheless, it's an excellent book. Jeff has written other books. Where can people find your resources? Because I know I can go on and on and on.
JRNyquist.blog is my website. If you go to my book page on Amazon.com, just put in J.R. Nyquist or Jeff Nyquist, you should find it. You've got The Lies We Believe In, The Fool and His Enemy, Red Jihad, which I did with Cliff Kincaid, and there are others there. Back from the Dead, Return of the Evil Empire. The New Tactics of Global War. There's a whole bunch of books there that people can read that I've done. So, and some with co-authors. I think it's and of course my blog, I try to keep people up on the news. I do interviews with Chinese dissidents, I do essays trying to understand different things. I go over the defector literature and the key points, and I discuss the strategies of World War III. So that's kind of what I do.
Well, thank you for joining us. That you provided an excellent summary of your opinions, of which was very valid and some interesting points that you made regarding the movie Civil War. I do recommend people see it. I definitely would love to see on your blog, once this is posted, a rich discussion on the world building scenarios and whether the U.S. is headed toward a path of civil war. That's not something we should wish for, whether you're on the right or the left or the center or apolitical, because it's going to have terrible consequences and it could usher in a I mean, if people think the US government is, quote, despotic now, or what we're living in is declining conditions,
Yeah.
You ain't seen nothing yet, baby.
Americans should never kill Americans for political reasons. It should never happen.
Nope.
Should not be.
Nope, but unfortunately, as we've reviewed, I was going to mention, I'm sorry to extend this, but I think it's an important point. When you look at even, unfortunately, groups like elements, many prominent or vocal elements of Democratic Socialist America, they talk about guillotining landlords with pictures.
Yeah.
They talk about ice picking, celebrating the assassination of Leon Trotsky. There was an article even in the World Socialist website about that was highly critical of that. I believe these people are serious. And if people like that, with those types of belief systems and opinions and visions and dreams, take power, it's inconceivable to us Americans.
Yeah. We have a lot of people who are not psychologically normal engaged in politics now. We don't seem to have a very good way of keeping them out.
Well, you're being too nice. I'm sorry to be on your case today. They're just bad, evil people. That's bad, evil stuff to celebrate killing like that.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that if you end up in a civil war, that's what you're going to end up doing. So you got to think really hard if you want to have blood on your hands. You want to encourage something like that. Remember that the virtue of a republic is that you can do things by arguing and rational argument. If we can recover our rationality, which is an open question.
Yep. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. We got to fling these facts like bullets and educate the viewers and let them make their own decisions. Thank you again, Jeff. Be well, and looking forward to our next interview.
Okay, thank you, Nevin.
Sure.